Good evening, everyone. The Jewish Community Council of Victoria acknowledges the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we reside. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. On behalf of the executive of the JCCV, I would like to acknowledge members of the Consular Corps, federal and state members of Parliament, local councillors, affiliate presidents and members of our community, and thank you for joining the virtual Holocaust commemoration. You will hear tonight from our survivors and presenters how, from the ashes of near extinction in World War II, our people have survived and flourished and developed a vibrant community here in Melbourne, Victoria. But in light of the global experience of the last 12 months, I want to tell you another story of the triumph of survival, that of the Thessalonican Jews. Thessalonica, Saloniki in northern Greece, was a significant Jewish community before the war. Census data records that in the early 1900s, almost 60% of its 100,000 total population was Jewish. They lived and worked in the port area of the city at all levels of society. Their presence and influence was such that the Sephardic Jewish language, Ladino, was used as the language of the docks, and the port itself did not operate on Saturdays. In April 1941, the Nazis entered Greece across the northeastern land borders with Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. Thessalonica was occupied, and the Jews were ghettoized. The Jewish cemetery was torn up, and the graves of 350,000 Jews were reused as building material. In March 1943, mass deportations commenced. The Thessalonican Jews were transported by cattle trucks directly to Auschwitz and Treblinka. Historians estimate that less than 2,000 survived. Like so many others, the 500-year-old Jewish community of Thessalonica was destroyed. And yet, Moise Bourla and Sarah Sayas were two of that small number of Thessalonican Jews who survived. They met after the war, married and had 2 children, including a son named Albert, born in 1961. Moise wanted his son Albert to do 2 things: become a scientist and marry a Jew. Young Albert did both. Albert has done brilliantly in his chosen profession. In 2019, he became CEO of the International Pfizer Pharmaceutical Company, and in 2020, its executive chairman, positions which he still holds today. It was Albert who led Pfizer to develop in record time the first 2-shot vaccine for the coronavirus. Albert Bourla has said the following of his parents' experiences during the war. "When my parents spoke of the Holocaust, they never spoke of anger or revenge. They didn't teach us to hate those who did this to our family and friends. Instead, they spoke of how lucky they were to be alive and how we all needed to build on that feeling, celebrate life and move forward. Hatred would only stand in the way." In 2019, shortly after Pesach, my family and I visited Thessalonica as part of a family reunion organised by my father. We heard from a relative, Moshe Ha'elyon, a formidable survivor of the camps, former artillery officer in the Israel Defence Forces, former member of the board of Yad Vashem, and Ladino poet. We said Kaddish, the memorial prayer for the dead, in the grounds of Aristotle University, built on the site of the former Jewish cemetery. Most importantly, we were warmly welcomed by a rebuilt community in their synagogue who hosted us for Shabbat Kiddush, the Friday evening meal. And what of Albert Bourla, the proud Thessalonican Jew who received his doctorate at that same Aristotle University built over the former Jewish cemetery, and who now strides the world stage of pharmaceuticals? I've never met him, but the first person in Greece to receive the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine was an elderly Jewish resident of an aged care facility in Thessalonica. This year's message, then, is not only looking backwards to what we have lost, but also looking around us to what we have achieved and continue to achieve, and in addition, looking forward to what we can offer. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the triumph of survival.
On the 25th of August 1944, at the final days of the liquidation of the Lodz Ghetto, I was only left with my mother. When we went to the trains, to the cattle trains, well, the description inside was a bucket to relieve ourselves and a bucket with water. There was nowhere to lie down. My mother, who was 53 years old at the time, I was 19 years of age. I knew where we were going to be taken. I hoped against hope. When we will arrive into Auschwitz-Birkenau, I will be able to help my mother as I was able to do in those years in the ghetto. How wrong I was. On arrival, when those heavy doors went flung open, the scream of the SS, the barking dogs, everybody out, men one side, women and children the other side. In those few precious moments, what I was still together with my mother. My mother was able to whisper in my ear, she said, Abraham, you should do everything humanly possible to survive. And when you will survive, wherever you will find yourself, you should tell people what happened to us and what was done to us. Because by knowing, people will be able to prevent such atrocities will never occur again anywhere in the world. And only a short while afterwards, I lost the last member of my family, what was under Nazi occupation, in the gas chambers of Birkenau. When so famous Dr. Mengele did the selection, 90% of the men who stood around me were sent to the immediate death. His finger didn't point at me. This is why I'm always saying, my survival, even I did a lot to survive, is 99% of luck. When we were stripped of our possession, I was only allowed to keep my shoes and belt. And after the shower, where everything was taken away, all hair on our body was shaved, and we were driven to this part of this huge death complex of Auschwitz-Birkenau, what was called the gypsy camp. A pair of trousers, a jacket, and a beret was thrown at me. I spent nearly 3 months in Auschwitz-Birkenau. I'm not going to describe the horrors, what I witnessed and survived. I made it my point to register in my mind everything what I witnessed, and I observed everything. I could see the smoke belching out of the chimneys of the crematoria. I was maybe 50 to 60 meters away. And I spent 3 months in hell. Then when I eventually was chosen to go to work, when we had to assemble, well, I had to make up my mind, because when this engineer came and asked who is a metal worker, I was in two minds. Should I step out or should I stay in the line? I didn't have anything to lose. I stepped out. He did ask me a single question. He did ask me because he looked for metal workers. I was working in the metal factory in the ghetto, so I stepped out. And he did ask me, how many turns a borer does in a bore machine? Who would notice? My luck was that I, in the factory for 2.5 years, was working at such a middle size of bore machine. So I gave him the answer what I knew. He didn't ask me another question. He sent me to another side. I didn't know it's the side to go to the gas chamber, or it's true, or being transported for slave labor in Germany. Well, I registered in my mind everything what I witnessed. I couldn't write it down. So I remember everything so vividly. And I promised in those darkest days, if I will survive, I will keep my word, what I pledged to my mother. That I will do everything humanly possible to try to help to educate the younger generation. And for the last 37 years, in the Jewish Holocaust Museum in Melbourne, I helped to educate the younger generation. And I'm still doing it to this day, and I hope to do it for many years. With mine and my wife's Zecher survival, so we are now 4th generation. This I'm calling, this is our victory. Because with mine and my wife's survival, like I said, it's 4th generation of Jewish people.
The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime, its allies and collaborators. During the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial and biological inferiority. Roma, Gypsies, people with disabilities, some Slavic peoples, Soviet prisoners of war, and black people. Other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds, among them communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals.
In 1933, when the Nazis came to power in Germany, the Jewish population of Europe stood at over 9 million.
Auf in Pripyatschik brennt a Feier und in Stub is heiß und der Rebbe lernt kleine Kinderlach dem Aleph Beis und der Rebbe lernt kleine Kinderlach dem Aleph Beis. Seitje Kinderlach, gedenkje Teire, was is lernt do, sagt je noch einmal und tage noch einmal, kommet alle vor, sagt je noch einmal und tage noch einmal, kommet alle vor. Als ihr wird Kinder älter werden, wird ihr allein verstehen, wie viel in die Oisjes liegen Tränen und wie viel Gewinn, wie viel in die Oisjes liegen Tränen und wie viel Gewinn. Als ihr wird Kinder dem Goles schleppen, ois gemutschet sein, sollt ihr von die Oisjes koiach scheppen, guckt in sei herein, sollt ihr von die Oisjes koiach scheppen, guckt in sein seid schon kinderlach, gedenkt schon teire, was ist lernt noch, sagt schon noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, kommet alle vor. Kommet alle vor.
Soon after they came to power, the Nazis adopted measures to exclude Jews from German economic, social and cultural life, and to pressure them to emigrate under the pretext that they posed a threat to Germany.
I was born Bela Lichter in Tarnów, Poland in 1928. I lived with my mother Dora and older sister Bert, and I never knew my father, Yehuda Tzvi Lichter. In 1933, we left my grandparents' home to stay with my uncle Sholem in Paris. We traveled and lived as a small unit. A single woman with 2 young daughters, and life was really very hard. I went to École de Belleville school in a poor neighborhood of Paris. I had already experienced anti-Semitism in France before the war, but this became much more severe and obvious after the outbreak of war in 1939. I remember clearly an episode which happened as a small girl of around 12 after the German occupation of Paris. There was no school that day, so I had been sent by a mother to buy a few items at the grocery store. I was wearing the Jewish yellow star during the 1-hour period we were permitted to get food. The queue was long, the hour had elapsed, and I was nearly at the front of the queue. So friendly people suggested that I hide the yellow star and stay in the queue. I was so young and did not appreciate the danger I was in. A lady behind me ran to a policeman nearby and denounced me as a Jewish girl breaking the curfew. The French policeman came, found the hidden yellow star, and took me to the police station. My mother came and begged the policeman for my release, but only after we were taken to the German police headquarters was I finally let go. I remember clearly how even the Nazis could not believe that the French police could be so cruel to a young girl for such a petty offense. How traumatic. Not everyone was so lucky. In the early morning of 16th of July 1942, the French police pounded on our door, waking us up and ordering us to pick up only what we could carry in our arms. We were taken to the police station where buses were loaded to transport us to the Velodrome d'Hiver, a famous bicycle velodrome where many thousands of Jews were herded together under the control of the local French police, who seemed to enjoy being cruel and merciless. You cannot imagine the condition. Everyone was scared and thirsty and hot, with so many children present, many of them crying all the time. There, with only 2 toilets available for this large horde of terrifying people. So the smell was overpowering. It was horrible. No one knew the intended fate. But after a few days, most of the prisoners were sent to internment camp and thereafter to Auschwitz, where a huge number were murdered. My mother was a seamstress, which saved our life, as her employer came to the velodrome and insisted on our release. It was miraculous. She worked in a factory making German uniform for a few months. A number of Jewish workers there discussed a plan where it be someone who knew someone with a contact from the resistance advised that to save our life, we, and firstly the children, should leave Paris and travel to the countryside for shelter. It was suggested that I, being young, small and agile, should go there first. I was given a train ticket and boarded the train alone to a farm in the Sarthe region, about 100 kilometers southwest of Paris. Can you imagine how hard it was for a frightened girl of 13 to make such a journey on her own? I still do not know how I did it. My mother and sister joined me later, and we stayed in the area called La Ferté-Bernard till the end of the war. Only then were we informed that these decent people who saved our lives were in fact members of the French resistance. We then returned to Paris, where we lived till 1951, when I sailed to Melbourne, Australia, sponsored by a relative already there. I got married to another Holocaust survivor, Sholek Schmerling. He had 4 children. Today, one lives in Melbourne, one in Sydney, and 2 in Israel. I'm a proud grandmother of 12 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild and 2 more on the way. They are all aware of my Shoah past, and some traveled with me in 2016 back to Poland for a roots trip. In 2012, we went to France and we visited the relevant location of my wartime experiences and met some of the French family who sheltered us. I hope that my children and future descendants will spread this memory to coming generations. May we never again have to experience such a time.
After occupying Poland, German authorities implemented radical measures against the Jews. They confined the Jewish population to ghettos, to which they also later deported thousands of Jews from the Third Reich. Hundreds of thousands of Jews perished from the horrendous conditions in the ghettos in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe.
Mass shootings continued throughout the war, many conducted by militarized battalions of the German Order Police, claiming the lives of more than 1.5 million Jews. In late 1941, Nazi officials opted to employ an additional method to kill Jews: stationary gas chambers. Between 1941 and 1944, Nazi Germany and its allies deported nearly 3 million Jews from areas under their control to Nazi-occupied Poland.
My name is Judy Colt. I was born in 1936, younger daughter to Stefan and Fela Jabłoński, timber millers from Sieradz in Poland. My big sister Tosia was 3 years older than me. When I was 3 years old, the war broke out, and the whole family wandered towards Warsaw, hoping that we'd get lost in the crowd there, but we were not lost in the crowd. We soon herded into the ghetto. My father was no longer with us. He was living on Aryan papers as a Christian Paul, working his odd business acquaintances, trying to get places to hide other members of the family, especially the children. After a while, for some reason, the entire family was moved to Otwock's ghetto. In Otwock's ghetto, I turned 4, and my grandmother made a beautiful birthday party for me. I even got a present, a whole apple to myself, and a half a pink pencil, and half-used coloring book. And then, after everyone was sang, my father took us to the forest, near the forest for a walk. And he said, "Now, my child, that you are 4 years old, no longer a child, I will teach you how to survive. You must never forget who you are, but never tell anybody. when speaking to people, look them straight in the eye and they won't know you are afraid. But if you are afraid, just tell the squirrels. There's a lot of squirrels in Poland. They will always find me and let me know, and I'll make sure you're all right. So I wasn't frightened, which was very helpful. In no time at all, my father managed to get us out of the ghetto, and for the next year or more, we're staying with different people in different places, under different names, sometimes in lofts, sometimes in cellars, sometimes in cupboards, sometimes in spaces under the staircase, wherever we could. And eventually we found a safe place in Rabka. In 1941, in December, the Gestapo started getting seriously dangerous around Rabka. So my cousin Isha, my big cousin, 16-year-old, took us out of there and got us to Warsaw, to my father's, where he had our hair dyed blonde and presented at the Convent of Immaculate Conception, directly across the road from the SS headquarters, which was a safe place in plain sight. In the convent, life was semi-normal, and in 1943, my sister Tosha was having her first communion. It was the day I'll never forget, the 1st of June 1943. All the parents of the communion girls were invited, my father among them, and the ceremony went well, and then all the parents took their children to restaurants for a meal. We no sooner sat down when 2 officers in dark uniforms came in and started shouting at my father in a language I didn't understand, and they took him away. It was dead still in the room. The waitress came in with the soup, spilled some on my sister's dress, bent down to clean it, and whispered, "Run, children, run." Tosha took my hand. We walked out steadily and walked steadily to the corner, and then we ran like mad until we hid in an agricultural plot among some maize. We waited till dark and went back to the convent. Sister Wanda had already been informed, and she had our bundles of clothes and food ready, and together with Sister Anna, the novice, we left and stayed in various convents and other places until we finally got to Wrzosów, to the Villa Yudchenko, where there was an orphanage and a trade school for girls. And we stayed there, occasionally helping out on the farms nearby. I really liked it there. I wanted to stay. Either that or just go to sleep and not have to wake up. But it wasn't to be. The front was coming closer. So we were moved. This time the peasant took us to Lasky, where there was a blind institute. We pretended to be blind children, and I really loved it there because there were a lot of squirrels in the forest there. And I knew my father knew where we were, and he was looking after us. And then one day, without warning, another peasant came and took us away. Apparently the front was coming closer again. And he took us to the back of an old house and said, "She's kind, she'll take you in." So he knocked on the door, and an old woman came out, and she said, "More orphans. Come in and I'll feed you." She gave us a pellet of straw, which she put by the tile oven, and a mug of soup each, and she said, "In the morning we'll talk. I only want to know your names, nothing else. What I don't know, I can't tell." And so it was. Tosha was doing work in the garden and cleaning the road. I was helping with dishes and other light chores, and we grew out of our clothes, but couldn't do nothing about it. And then one day, I saw a mirage. I thought it was my mother, but I didn't quite remember what she looked like. But it was Mother. She found us, but she couldn't take us until she found a safe place for us to hide. And she promised she'd be back soon, which she was. So together we hid in a few other places, on a farm and other places. And we finished up in a loft in Piastów with some other people. Early in the morning, before it was light, Mom took my hand and we went out to forage for food in rubbish heaps. And we heard Russian voices singing. And then we saw these gruffy Russian soldiers coming towards us. Mom threw herself on the ground and kissed the soldiers' dirty boots and started crying, and the soldiers were crying, and I was crying. And I said, why are we crying? Have they finally come to kill us? And Mama said, no, darling, I'm crying because I'm so happy we are free. So she collected all the children that my father had hidden in different places. And we all went back to Sieradz to wait for someone else to come back. My uncle Nathan, Mom's brother, was the only one who came back. All the other brothers and sisters-in-law had gone, and all the children. My mother was the third youngest of 83 grandchildren when the war broke out. 9 survived. My father lost about 40 relatives that I knew of. I'm sure there was more. So we stayed on the mill until the pogrom in Kielce, and Mom was too frightened. So Nathan and Mother paid what we would now call people smugglers, and they took us to Berlin, to Schlachtensee camp, where we waited for our permits. Eventually, we got permits in 1952, and on the 29th of September 52, we arrived in Port Melbourne. And that feisty, beautiful little woman, my mother, Fela Jabłońska, started building a new life for us.
At the Wannsee Conference in Berlin in January 1942, the SS and representatives of German government ministries planned the final solution, a plan to remove 9 million European Jews, including those from non-occupied countries such as Great Britain, Sweden and Turkey. Jews from Germany and German-occupied Europe were deported by rail to the killing centers in occupied Poland. The Germans attempted to disguise their intentions, referring to deportations as resettlement to the east. The victims were told that they were to be taken to labor camps, but in reality, from 1942 onward, deportation for most Jews meant death. The vast majority were sent to killing centers, often called extermination camps, at Belzec, Chelmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were murdered primarily by means of poison gas.
Some able-bodied Jewish deportees were temporarily spared to perform forced labor in ghettos, labor camps for Jews, or concentration camps. Most of these workers died from starvation and disease, or were killed when they became too weak to work. In the final months of the war, SS guards moved camp inmates by train or on forced marches, often called death marches, hoping to prevent the Allied liberation of large numbers of prisoners. As Allied forces moved across Europe in a series of offensives against Germany, they began to encounter and liberate concentration camp prisoners, as well as prisoners en route from one camp to another. The marches continued until May the 7th, 1945, the day the German armed forces surrendered to the Allies.
My name is Philip Meisel. I was born in Vilna when it was under Polish occupation. Vilna actually is the capital of Lithuania. But when I was born, it was Poland. I had an older brother, Joseph, and a twin sister, Bella. I went to a very good school, and till 1939, when the war broke out, I have a comparatively very happy childhood. In a year's time, in 1941, Vilna was occupied by German troops. Nobody expected the Germans could be so cruel and enforce the German Nazi law of the Jewish population in Vilna. In September of 1941, we were put into ghetto. In ghetto, I stayed for 2 years. 60,000 people were put into Vilna ghetto. Only 14,000 survived. To survive in the ghetto, you have to have a trade which is very useful for German. I became an auto electrician, and this saved my life. In 1943, when the ghetto was liquidated, I was sent with another approximately 2,000 or 3,000 Jews to Estonia. Germans were very short of oil, and in Estonia they found shale rock. And they used Jews to mine the shale rock and build a superstructure. I was fortunate that I got a job as an automotive electrician in a traveling garage, German traveling garage, which traveled all over Germany. That the Germans were losing the war, and I was transported back to Germany. I found myself in the Stutthof concentration camp. I stayed there for a very short time, I think about 3 weeks, until I was again sent to southern Germany to a camp called Dautbergen in Württemberg. They found there's the similar oil, shale rock, and as they assumed that to have experience in mining this rock, they kept us there. This was an extremely bad camp. There were about 2,000 pupils, and approximately 60 people were dying every year. Conditions were so bad that as I started to work again as an automotive electrician, the foreman of the garage saw the condition in which you are living, and he asked for us to be transferred to a different camp, Frommer. Frommer was a camp where political prisoners, Belgian, French, Dutch, were stationed. The camp was run by a French officer who every Sunday was providing us with news, and we could see that Germans lost the war, and eventually I will be liberated. What was important that when I was still in Estonia, I promised my friend, if I will survive even for 5 minutes, I will tell the world what happening under Nazi occupation, how Jews and other people, but particularly Jews, were treated. When I was liberated and I retired, I started to work in the Jewish Holocaust Center. I was in charge of Testimonies Project. The center has to teach young generation about the Holocaust, to teach them about justice, acceptance, tolerance, and the testimonies which I was collected were a very big help, because they described how people fight the Holocaust. It's very difficult for an individual to identify himself with the 6 million people. But when they came in touch with the description of the Holocaust by individual person, they had easier identify with the person. I worked there for 30 years. I helped to educate the new generation of people. And we're teaching people how to be decent people. Teaching them they should be prejudiced, should be tolerant. There is only one race in the world, it's a human race. And in their future life, they should see the world as it is and even improve the world to a small extent in which they are able to do it. And this is the most important message for young people.
In Germany before the war, there was a man who owned a store. In 1934, in Dusseldorf. And every night at 5:09, he'd cross the park down to the Rhine. He'd sit there by the shore. I'm looking at the river, but I'm thinking of the sea. I'm thinking of the sea. I'm looking at the river, but I'm thinking of the sea. A little girl has lost her way, with hair of gold and eyes of gray, reflected in his glasses as he watches her. A little girl has lost her way, with hair of gold and eyes of gray. I'm looking at the river, but I'm thinking of the sea. I'm thinking of the sea, thinking of the sea. We lie beneath the autumn sky, my little golden girl and I, and she lies very still.
By the end of the war in 1945, nearly 2 out of every 3 European Jews were dead. Hatred of the Jews, of course, did not disappear with the end of the fighting, and liberation did not ensure a return to normal life. The years of terror and fear had destroyed the essential fabric of life as most survivors knew it. Somehow, they had to pick up the pieces and begin new lives, especially if their homes had been lost or appropriated by others. Together with grief, for some survivors, there were also feelings of guilt at having to survive at all. Others felt driven by the need to pursue justice, however futile a task that might seem.
My name is Herman Harry Vetter. I'm a child Holocaust survivor, and I'm extremely privileged to have been saved by a righteous family, a Catholic Polish family, who risked their lives and the lives of their children to save me. And that's why I'm here today. I normally speak of that I have had 3 lives. My first life began in the mid-1930s when I was born to a Jewish family in Poland, South Poland. My mother, my father, and I had 2 older sisters. Shortly after I was born, we moved from the little village to a city by the name of Cieszyn on the border of Czechoslovakia, where my father had a butcher shop, and we lived as a very happy family, and I have very fond memories during that period of time. But all of that finished when my second life began, when the war started in 1939. My father went towards the Russian border, and my mother was left to care for the 3 of us as best as she could. I have memories of us trying to run away from the German army because we were on the border of Czechoslovakia. We were there very early in the war. And we were actually going towards the place where my grandparents used to live. One of my worst memories that I still remember, and it is what caused me to learn what fear really was about, was when we entered a town by the name of Sulm. As we entered the town, it was being bombed by the German aeroplanes. My mother grabbed us and we ran into a double-story building which looked like a pub, at least that's the picture I have of it. And I suddenly heard a man running in, screaming, "If you want to live, get out." My mother grabbed the 3 of us and pushed us into the street, and we were crawling away in the ditch next to the road. When I heard this horrible noise, turned around and saw the building exploding with bricks flying everywhere. That scene scared me to the point that I think I changed from being a very young, small boy to a grown-up child. We were very shortly after that caught by the Germans and taken back to Cieszyn and put into the Cieszyn ghetto, which we stayed there for quite a while. This wasn't a ghetto that had barbed wire or fences on. It was just a suburb of the town where the Germans pushed all the Jewish people in. I have some records of my mother actually going out, getting special permission because she had to sign a book to do so. But I think it is at that time that she met up with the Skovrons and probably made some arrangements. We were then moved to Sosnowiec ghetto, which is not that far from Auschwitz. It was a ghetto which was very much a transit ghetto for people taken to Auschwitz. But I also have a fairly shocking memory of when my mother went off to work, including a friend of ours, and they both went to work. The 3 of us were in our room. We had Jewish people come and knock on the door, telling us that we had to come out in the street because our mother had given them permission for us to do so. When we went out into the street, we were gathered up by the German soldiers and taken to a railway station and placed on wagons, cattle wagons, which I can still well remember. And we were headed at that stage for Auschwitz. My mother's friend, who worked in the Gestapo office, when she heard what was happening, asked the boss if he could do something, and he said yes. He took her to the railway station, called her our names as he walked along the train, and we were taken off the train. When we got back into the ghetto, I think it was at that stage that my mother decided that she would give me to the Skovrons to be hidden. I don't know why she chose me and not one of my sisters, but that's the reason I guess I'm alive here. I went to the Skovrons across a fence. My time at the Skovrons was virtually hiding either in the attic, the cellar, or behind a wardrobe. And we had 3 German soldiers billeted in our house. On one evening, it was cold, it was winter. The 3 German soldiers were sitting on a sofa, little knowing that I was lying flat out underneath them. After the war, my mother did not return to pick me up. And when the war was fully declared over, they gave me to a Jewish home in Krakow on the promise that if no one found me, they would take me back. When suddenly my sister, oldest sister, found me, she survived Auschwitz and was rescued and taken to Sweden after the war. 2 days before I left for Sweden, my father returned from Russia. 2 days before I had to leave him and go to Sweden. He couldn't unfortunately come to Australia at the time and didn't come till much later. I came out to Australia in 1946 on my birthday. Sydney Harbour, I guess, was my birthday, and that's the start of my 3rd life, a very fruitful life. I went to school, did an apprenticeship, studied part-time, and became an engineer. I got married. I have a wife, 2 sons, 2 daughter-in-laws, and 7 grandchildren. 1 already married and 1 virtually married. So my life has been pretty good. And what my story is the story of that we must never forget. It must never happen again. And we certainly should have the courage to be upstanders and not bystanders.
In the aftermath of the Holocaust, more than 250,000 survivors found shelter in displaced persons camps run by the Allied powers and the United Nations Refugee and Rehabilitation Administration in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Between 1948 and 1951, 136,000 Jewish displaced persons migrated to Israel, while others made homes in the United States and nations outside Europe, including Australia. Melbourne, per capita, received the 2nd largest influx of survivors anywhere in the world, doubling its Jewish population despite the harsh quotas applied by the Australian Immigration Department, stipulating that no more than 25% of the immigrants on a ship could be Jewish.
Years later, some would turn to testimony and recording of memories, the products of which younger members of the community take for granted, but which for many was too dreadful a task to contemplate for decades, unleashing the all too vivid memories as so many wanted to suppress. These testimonies are held at the Jewish Holocaust Centre here in Melbourne and at other centres of commemoration. In the meantime, there were families to be rebuilt, lives to be lived. The affirmation of choose life, uvacharta v'chayim, is the quintessential Jewish response to tragedy and destruction.
Every survivor's story is the same, and yet every survivor's story is unique. The same because it entailed survival against unbelievable odds, and unique because each survival was the result of totally different circumstances. And beyond the circumstances, it relied on the strength and courage of the individual. Because I was a baby, my survival relied on the strength and courage of my mother, Hadassah. My name is Nina Bassett, previously Janina Katz, and I was born in Lvov, Poland in 1939. My mother, Hadassah Vargon, came from Jędrzejów. My father, Isidor Katz, from Lvov, where he studied law and followed this up with a commercial diploma. Until the Shoah, they lived what my mother described as an idyllic life. This changed in September 1939, when we came under Russian occupation. However, we did not suffer the hunger and the cold and the constant persecution suffered at that time by the Jews in the west of Poland. It was only after the second German invasion of Lvov in June 1941 that our lives were shattered. On the 25th of July 1941, the day before my father's 30th birthday, 2,000 Jews were taken away and murdered. My father was one of them. It was not until years later that my mother discovered what had happened that day, and in the meantime, she continued to live in hope that she would be reunited with my father. 2 months after my father was taken away, my mother and I were thrown out of our apartment and forced to relocate to the area which in November 1941 became the Lvov ghetto. My mother had to work for the Germans, what we now call slave labor, as a gardener, and whilst she was working, my grandmother Cecilia Katz looked after me. Throughout 1942, there were many deportations from the ghetto, and whilst these were described as relocations, it gradually became clear that they were far more sinister than that. In August 1942, my grandmother and I were taken from the ghetto as part of another deportation. My mother was informed of what had happened. She ran away from her work and raced around the street until she found us. We were near the end of the queue, and like any 3-year-old, I let go my grandmother's hand and ran towards my mother. The German soldier guarding the queue looked at me, clinging to my mother, and said to her, "Is she yours? Take the child and disappear." My mother tried desperately to get my grandmother released from the queue, and when she kept arguing, the soldier responded, "I have told you, take your child and disappear. I've told you the second time, there will not be a third time." My mother took my hand and we went. That was the last time that I held my grandmother Cecilia's hand. She was on the deportation that went to Belzec. After that, the ghetto became smaller and smaller, and my mother realized that if we were to stay there, we would be doomed, and she carefully planned our escape. My mother had acquired Aryan papers. She became Helena Kancevich, I became Yasha Kancevich, and in the early morning on a January day in 1942, we escaped the ghetto. She found refuge with some Polish people, a few days here, a few days there, but she realized this was not tenable as a long-term solution. So my mother went looking for Marysia Mandziuk, a Ukrainian woman who had been our maid before the war and whom my mother had helped on a number of occasions. She took us in, and we stayed with Marysia and her family, first in her small apartment and later in the house on the outskirts of Lvov until we were liberated in July 1944. But Marysia told everyone that I was her niece because you can't hide a 3-year-old. But my mother was hidden, and she was relying on her 4-year-old child, not revealing that she was there. Her life depended on it. Marysia has been recognized by Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among the nations. After liberation, my mother returned into the center of Lvov, desperately looking for family. From my father's family, nobody survived. I was the only survivor. My mother then returned to Jędrzejów to see if anyone from her family had survived, and she found her younger brother. Later, she found out that her sister and niece had survived Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Bergen-Belsen, and we were finally all reunited in a German displaced person camp. I have stripped the story to its bare outlines, but there are some things I need to stress. I have yet to meet another child survivor of the Lvov ghetto, and I hope I do so at some stage, because there is enormous pain and grief thinking that there is no one else. Tomorrow is my 82nd birthday, and the soldier who told my mother to take me and disappear has enabled me to have 79 years of life, which I may not have had. And it has been a wonderful life with my husband and my children, my grandchildren and my great-grandchild. What happened in those horrific years and the losses that were sustained have not been forgotten, but my focus has been on joy and survival, and that is the victory of looking at my whole tribe. I hope that we can sometimes, perhaps not in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of my children or grandchildren, live in a place without hatred. Hatred is the most invidious disease. It destroys everything. And I don't know that there are any antidotes to it, but perhaps we can try not to cure it, but to ameliorate it with empathy, with tolerance, and with kindness. And if there is even one day that we can make someone's life more bearable, that's perhaps what we should do.
Tonight's commemoration honours in particular those survivors who made Melbourne their home. With energy and determination, they embraced Australian society, engaging with all sectors: commerce, health, science, education, the arts, and philanthropy. They brought European flavours to Melbourne's cultural and culinary scene, with establishments such as Mirka's Cafe, run by Georges and Mirka Mora, which quickly attracted the bohemian artist set. The iconic Scheherazade on Ackland Street, established by Avram and Masha Zhelezhnikov, a meeting place for so many to share their stories, argue politics, and more. Thanks to the enterprising Mendel Glick, from humble beginnings in the late 1960s, a bagel empire was born.
The Kadima Jewish Cultural Center provided a focal point for Yiddish culture and artistic endeavor, with its own fierce brand of politics. Businesses flourished, especially in the rag trade on Flinders Street, while accounting and law firms evolved. Institutions of care and education grew: Montefiore Homes, the various Jewish day schools. Today, Melbourne's medical and education professions are populated by the descendants of these early determined settlers. In rare cases, it was the Shoah experience itself that became the basis for renewal and for connection, with the Buchenwald Boys and their commitment to find joy amid loss exemplified in their annual ball.
My name is Katrina Colt, and this is my son, Jonathan Green. What is the impact of being the daughter and granddaughter of survivors of the Holocaust? Well, it's quite the legacy. My overriding strength is one of resilience, and I know that I've inherited that from these two amazing survivors.
Being the son of two Holocaust survivors who, to my great fortune, are still with us, it's been an interesting time right from when I was born to this very minute. I was made aware of the Holocaust when I was about 4 years old. Any question I had, I was given answers truthfully and to the best of their ability to explain it to me. They are both amazing people, resilient people, full of life, which is amazing considering what they went through. They imbued in me a thirst for the truth, a sense of right and justice, and also gave me a mission in life as well to confront any issues dealing with the Holocaust with the truth, as I found it, wherever I found it. I was also part of the same youth movement and political movement that Dad was in, which was the Bund and Skiff, and very aware of social injustice and the need for us as Jews, and especially children of survivors, to impart the message of the truth through education and through day-to-day discussions with people who are not aware of what happened or have a very, very faint knowledge of what happened, because the truth is always the key, as is education. And the rights of people, and also ethics, which are very important, but also we must always confront evil, which is what the Holocaust is an embodiment of, with humanity, with truth, and wherever with strength, and the strength of purpose. When I was about 10 years old, I asked my father, "Do you hate the Germans?" And he got a stern look on his face, his finger came out, and I knew I'd asked something that was not right. And he said to me, "Don't you ever use that word." And I asked him, "What word is that?" And he said, "Hate." Because the instant you give in to that emotion, what is it that you become? And that's a very, very interesting way of looking at things. But that sums up both my father and my mother. After whatever they went through, they do not hate. They remember, and all they want to do is for the truth to be told.
And significantly, mindful of the imperative to remember, to honor the experiences, to ensure ignorance would never again rationalize hate, the Jewish Holocaust Center emerged, providing a central role for not only the survivor community, but also for generations to come. Other organizations have evolved, such as March of the Living and Courage to Care, determined not only to keep the lessons of our history alive, but to help fashion ways forward in a world yet again bubbling with discrimination, racism, and words uttered in ignorance and hatred.
I'm Neda Schmerling, granddaughter of my Baba Bella Barclay. I grew up surrounded by images and conversations about the Shoah and the destruction of European Jewry. All four of my grandparents survived the Shoah, each one of them with his or her own individual, miraculous story of survival. My Baba went through so much. She experienced poverty and hardship, cruel anti-Semitism, and vicious police brutality. But she also encountered acts of goodness, kindness, and resistance to the atrocities, including by the family who sheltered her in regional France. She still speaks with those family descendants regularly. My Baba barely finished primary school while I finished university. She is intelligent and could have progressed far in a profession if she only had the opportunity. She was excluded and humiliated as a Jew, while I've never experienced these things. Her youth was full of fear, loss, and deprivation, while all I've known is love, stability, and support. So the contrasts are striking, but I am inspired by her attitude, as of all my grandparents, of devotion to family, courage to continue the future and make a better life for their descendants. Baba's stories left a huge impression on me, always reminding me of how lucky I am to be living in Australia at a time of safety and comfort for Jews, as well as living during a period when Israel provides a source of huge pride and security for Jews everywhere.
Many of my dad's family and friends died during the Holocaust, simply for being Jewish. Dad was lucky. He survived against insurmountable odds. For the last 30 years, Dad has Dad has volunteered at the Jewish Holocaust Centre, videotaking testimonies of Holocaust survivors. These testimonies are a priceless record for the future. They have the power to educate forthcoming generations about the Holocaust, and they also help spread the message of tolerance, understanding, and brotherhood.
The most vibrant of legacies is, of course, the thriving community itself, the ultimate tribute to survival, despite the concerted efforts of so many bent on annihilation and denial. Determined to recreate that which was lost, survivors invigorated existing community structures, added new ones, and ensured that every aspect of communal life, from welfare to education, from intellectual to sporting, from religious to secular, was an integral part of Melbourne Jewish life.
Hi, I'm Nanette. I'm Harry's middle grandchild. I've been honoured that I've been asked to speak tonight with my grandfather Harry and kind of give a bit of perspective as a descendant of a Holocaust survivor. From my grandfather, I got his brain. I got his enjoyment of learning, and I got the ability to tease my father. But what my grandfather Harry has taught me is he's basically just taught me the importance of being strong and resilient and standing up for people who don't always have the ability to stand up for themselves. He's taught me it's so important to be involved with human rights issues and discuss them and to make a statement and go against what people are saying and do what's right rather than what's the norm. My grandfather has been a really big figure in my life. He has guided me through times I'm indecisive and has helped me along the way to see the amazing person that you can become. He's so hardworking and he just perseveres within life. And he always speaks about how he's had his 3 lives, but he's made so much out of this 3rd life. And I'm so honored I've been able to be part of it and be a representation of what he's brought into this world. So I want to end this off by saying, Jaja, I love you so much. I'm so proud. I'm absolutely amazed by the person you are and what you've given to me and all the opportunities.
I would like you to meet our daughter, Sally, from Israel, who's our oldest child, and who will speak on behalf of our 3 children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchild.
I'm sitting here with my granddaughter, Netta. The impact that being a descendant of Shoah survivors has on me changed over time. My mother, Nina, told me that she was fortunate that during the Holocaust, she was a young child who wasn't fully aware of what was happening. My grandmother, Hadassah, and step-grandfather, Abi, told me that they were grateful that they were not in captivity during most of the war. They believed that the mental anguish of being a prisoner for a long time would have defeated them. My mother's cousin Masha did not have these consolations. She rarely mentioned her history. Instead, she focused on the present and showed me how to appreciate and embrace people from all nations, cultures, and religions, and how to live life passionately. Throughout my youth, I found my mother and grandparents' sense of gratitude when they remembered this period of immense suffering, and Masha's ability not to be defined by persecution perplexing. Their reactions to their experiences didn't seem possible, but their words and actions remained with me, and now I find them inspiring.
El Molei Rachamim Shochein Ba'meromim Dayan Almanot Ve'avi Hametei menucha nechona tachat kanefei hashechino v'mahalot kedoshim utehorim kezar rakia meirim umazhirim eteni yishmot acheinu b'nei Yisrael הקדושים והטהורים שנפלו בידי הנאצים הרוצחים ועוזריהם הרשעים ונשפך דמם באושוויץ, מיידנק, טרבלינקה ובשאר מחנות השמד באירופה שנהרגו ושנשרפו ושנשחטו ונקברו חיים ומתו בכל מיתות משונות ואכזריות על קדושת השם. בעבור שאנחנו בניהם ובנותיהם אחיהם ואחיותיהם מתפללים בעד הזכרת נשמתם. בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם, לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים. ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם. אדוני מאוד נחלתם וינוחו בשלום על משכבם ונאמר אמן. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא יברך ירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומייכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה.
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלל, שמי דקודשא בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
Commemoration is an imperative, not a choice.
Communal commemoration invokes the need to remember together. This year, although we have again been physically separated by circumstances, we are nevertheless joined in a virtual community.
But as always, regardless of its form, we remain a strong and proud community committed to remembering.
We know that you, the survivors, have bequeathed to the descendants and to the community a dual legacy. As inheritors of Mitzvah of Zachor, remembrance, we are aware that we carry the obligation to remember the Shoah,
to keep memory alive, and to be vigilant in speaking out against anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. We must serve as Shorim, protectors of our people and our world.
We are also the inheritors of a legacy, of looking towards the future with an optimism that allows for continued building of families, structures, community, and epitomizing the spirit of She'erit Haptelah.
Rather than surrendering to despair and grief, we acknowledge the pain of the past while simultaneously choosing life. Join us as we acknowledge that spirit in the Song of the Partisans.
Sag nicht einmal, dass du gehst dem letzten Weg. Kannst immer bleiben, verstellen neue Tag. Kommen weg nach unser Haus, geweckte Schau. Es wird erbeugt von unser Trotz, wir seien da. Kommen weg nach unser Haus, geweckte Schau. Es wird erbeugt von unser Trotz, wir seien da. Von grünem Hand wir weißem Land von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Bein, mit unser Weg. Und wo gefahren ist, spritzt von unser Blut. Schwarzen Wetter und unser Ruhe, unser Mut. Und wo gefahren ist, spritzt von unser Blut. Schwarzen Wetter und unser Ruhe, unser Mut. Es wird die Morgensen vergehen unser Heinz. Und der Gedanken wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Noch heute versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajau. Wie Apparat und Industrie von Dort zu Dort. Noch heute versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajau. Wie Apparat und Industrie von Dort zu Dort. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Sie sehen kein Lied von Erfolg und läuft herbei. Das Wort Erfolg zwischen Wahlen nicht gewinnt. Das Lied gesungen mit Kaganes in die Hand. Das Wort Erfolg zwischen Wahlen nicht gewinnt. Das Lied gesungen mit Kaganes in die Hand. Du sag nicht einmal, dass du gehst den letzten Weg. Kannst immer bleiben, verstellen neue Tag. Kommen weg nach unser Haus, geweckte Schau. Es wird erbeugt von unser Trott, wir seien da. Kommen weg nach unser Haus, geweckte Schau. Es wird erbeugt von unser Trott, wir seien da.
What a moving performance by the choir of Sholem Alechem School. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a perfect example of the triumph of survival, this evening's theme. I thank you all for attending, and I wish you all good night.